So they start with the first part, which is, does disagreement in fact lead to perceptions of bias? So I think terrorism provides a nice example for looking at this, because there's two ways in which you could look, for example, at suicide terrorists. Ehud Sprinzak, I think, summarized this nicely, right? So one way you can look at them is that they're basically biased. Everything they do is motivated by extreme hatred and brainwashing and extreme pressures to conform. And the other way is that they're just cold, rational killers. They're just engaging in objective analysis of the options that are available to them, and they're acting accordingly. So our first assumption was that the more you disagreed with these individuals, the more you would think that they were biased as opposed to rational actors. And I should note that these two different views are, of course, very much present in political science and the media. It's not like we all agree, even political scientists agree on which of these things are true. So people might hold, these two different views. So the first thing we do is we just ask people how much they disagreed with the concerns, with the goals of suicide terrorists. This was done in the context of the Middle East. And you can see that the more people said they disagreed with them, the more they perceived them as irrational and biased, the less they perceived them as rational and objective. And this was true after controlling for people's political right-left ideology and various things like that you could control for. We've also manipulated disagreement, I should say. So you can actually find out what people's position is on an issue and then face them with an adversary who either disagrees with them a lot or a little, and then find out how biased they perceive that person to be, and you get the same effect. So it's not reliant on a correlational design. But the next question then is, what happens as a result of these perceptions of bias? Do they, in fact, lead people to want to behave more aggressively rather than cooperatively? So what we did was we produced two versions of a New York Times article that was supposed to be on the mind of the terrorist. And people didn't know it was a fake article. And in fact, everything in the article was actually based on real scholarship. We just took all of it and put it together in one of two versions of the article. So you either got the terrorists are rational and objective article, or you got the terrorists are irrational and biased article. And they were just real scholarly quotes. So you have Robert Pape, the famous scholar from the University of Chicago, saying, look, suicide attackers are rarely brainwashed through heavy indoctrination by religious cults. They're rational actors. They're just engaging in objective analysis of their options. And you've got Mia Bloom, who's saying the opposite. No, actually, they're just, from when they're young children, they're subtly indoctrinated into a culture glorifying a cult-like leader. So they get one of these versions or the other that has the various quotes like this. And then we just give our subjects standard public opinion questions about how terrorism should be combated. And what you see is, so if you look at the militaristic kind of options, people who've just read that terrorists are essentially biased and irrational favor airstrikes, assassinations, things like this, over people who've read the terrorists are objective. They disfavor things like diplomacy relative to their peers. And in fact, those who've just read that terrorists are biased and irrational actually prefer airstrikes and assassination to diplomacy and negotiation. On the other hand, those who've just read that terrorists are actually just objective thinkers now prefer diplomacy to bombing. And sort of a surprising effect, I think, when you think about the fact that these were Princeton students. They, lived close to New York. They certainly had thought a lot about terrorist attacks, and it's not something that they were unfamiliar with. And yet this very simple manipulation that led them to view terrorists in one way or another led them to have these different preferences. And the reason for that was driven by their belief about whether terrorists could be reasoned with. That was statistically what drove the effect. It wasn't that in the objective condition they kind of came to like terrorists more. And said, oh, I kind of like them. They're reasonable people, so I wouldn't want to bomb them. They were equally disliked in both conditions. It wasn't anything like that. OK, so the last thing that I wanted to talk about with you was to try to think about, given that this tendency to see bias in others while presuming our own objectivity, given that it can be a problem, both in terms of the aggressive and conflictual behavior that it can cause, and also because sometimes we actually just really care about being accurate, and so being biased and not recognizing it is just a problem. For these reasons, it would be nice to know what can we do to try to ameliorate this asymmetry and bias perception. And in order to answer that question, the way that I wanted to do it, of course, was to go back to the theory. Let's figure out what's causing it, and let's intervene on that. So what I suggested to you earlier in the talk is that a cause of this has to do with overvaluing personal introspections. So if I put a lot of weight on my own motives and intentions and all this stuff that's going on in my head and trying to figure out whether I'm biased, I won't think I'm biased because bias occurs non-consciously. So I'm not going to find evidence of it by looking inwards. So what if we just educate people about the fact that introspection is not so reliable? What if we educate people about the fact that actually a lot of what influences you does so without you even being consciously aware of it? So if we get people not to overvalue their personal introspections, then, we reasoned, that should get people to not see themselves as less biased than others. So if we just intervene on the cause, we should be able to get rid of the effect. So what we did was we had people read, I don't expect you to be able to read this, by the way. We had people to read what they believed was an article from Science magazine. And I'll show you some of the highlights. The basic idea was to educate people about the importance of non-conscious processes in guiding judgment and behavior, and therefore about the perils of relying on introspection. So people learned about these great results in our field, like when you non-consciously cue elderly stereotypes for college undergraduates, they then walk more slowly down a hallway, like as though they were old people. So they read about these effects, and they read about sort of the importance of these non-conscious cues in guiding behavior, and about the fact that people don't know that any of this is going on. So they received the sort of what we might call introspective education, education about sort of the limits of relying on introspection. After reading this article, we had them complete our standard measure of the bias blind spot. Remember that figure I showed you at the beginning where we describe to people different biases, and we say, how much do you show this bias? How much do other people show it? We had them do that. What we found was that in the control condition, where they just read a control article, they showed the usual tendency to think that other people are more biased than I am. On the other hand, after people had been educated that looking inwards, not such a reliable thing to do, you might be influenced by things without your knowing it, the actual article didn't mention bias at all. It was just educating you about the importance of non-conscious processes and not relying on introspection. Those people didn't show this bias blind spot. And the two conditions differed from each other in that regard. OK, so let me just summarize what I've told you today. People recognize the influence of bias, including ideological bias, in others more so than in themselves. They sometimes can be blind to these biases in themselves and can exaggerate them in other people. This asymmetry derives from a number of factors. One, just from self-serving motives, desire to see oneself in a positive light. Also from valuing introspective information, more in the case of oneself than others, whereas in the case of others, we may look to behavior. And also from disagreement, from the fact that other people sometimes see things differently from the way we do. And in those cases, we may be more prone to see them as biased and maintain our perception of our own objectivity. And finally, I've tried to suggest to you that these perceptions of bias can be quite important, in particular because of the role that they can play in fueling and perpetuating a conflict spiral. And I've suggested one possible way of trying to overcome these asymmetric perceptions of bias that actually involves educating people about the perils of looking inwards to introspection. Thanks very much.